Honorable Ambassador Lucie Samcová Helga, Honorable Acting Director of the Directorate of CLIMA.A of the European Commission, Ms. Elina Bardram, Honorable Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Action of the Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources of Iceland, Ms. Helga Barðadóttir, Honorable CEO of Greenfo, Mr. Stefán Sveinbjörnsson, respected Icelanders and foreign citizens, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this first CIF seminar on the Green Deal and climate action in Iceland. On December 12, 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted by 196 states across the world. The Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal is to keep the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, 5 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, 187 states and the European Union, representing about 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, have ratified and consented to the agreement, including China and India. However, at the present times, we are emitting about 1.3 kilotons of CO2 equivalents per second. We have about 300 billion tons of CO2 equivalents left before we surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set in the Paris Agreement. Accordingly, we have, based on current emission rates, about 7 years left before reaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and about 25 years left before we surpass the 2 degrees Celsius warming target. The International Panel of Climate Change outlines that this goal can only be reached by reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and sequestrating previously emitted greenhouse gases. The IPCC also outlines and warns of devastating impacts if the world surpasses the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. While this is a huge challenge, it represents also an unprecedented opportunity for innovation, new technologies, and new business opportunities. Both the Icelandic government and the European Union have generated important incentives to help initiate a more sustainable and climate-friendly economy. It is my pleasure to open this seminar about the world's biggest challenge, but also the biggest economic opportunity that modern economies have ever seen. I'm delighted to introduce 4 keynote speakers, which all have extensive knowledge on how to tackle the climate crisis while creating new business opportunities. After the 4 keynote speakers have ended their talk, we will have time to take questions from the audience and discuss the presented initiatives in detail. I would like to ask the audience to write the questions they have in the chat of the Zoom video meeting. Furthermore, to make this seminar as interactive as possible, I would like you to use a web browser on your mobile phone or on your computer without closing the Zoom meeting window, and go to menti.com and type in the code that will appear in the Zoom window to access the interactive question format. Herewith, I would like to ask all members in the audience to go to menti.com as seen on the screen right now, type in the code 4563523, and answer the question, who is responsible to tackle the challenge of climate change? Feel free to answer as freely as you want. We will look at the answers at the end of the 4 talks and try to address your concerns specifically. Also, if you have specific questions regarding the presentations, please type them into the chat of this video conference. I would like to introduce as a first speaker our Honorable Ambassador, Lucie Samcová Helga, Head of the EU Delegation to Iceland.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, students, and good morning to everybody who's joining us this morning. I would like to first extend my thanks to you, David, and to the University of Reykjavik for hosting this event and for coming with the idea, and also thank all my co-panelists and co-speakers for taking part. I think that we have a great panel this morning. It's very good to have a balance between the EU side, the Icelandic side, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. It is a great pleasure for me to be speaking at an event which is specifically about the European Green Deal, because the Green Deal really is a flagship initiative of the EU, through which we want to make a real difference. And we want to make a real difference not just within Europe, but also globally. The Green Deal, and we'll speak about it in more detail this morning, is highly ambitious. And it's highly ambitious because it has to be. It has to be if we are to make a difference and make it fast. The objective of the deal is to make Europe the first climate neutral continent. It was presented in 2019 as a roadmap, really, for turning climate and environmental challenges into opportunities, and for making the transition just and inclusive for all. And again, we'll speak about this in a bit more detail, but I think that already the key terms here are very important. Opportunities, not just challenges, and being just and inclusive. The Green Deal really provides quite a comprehensive plan for a number of areas, from boosting the efficient use of resources, moving to a clean circular economy, restoring biodiversity, cutting pollution, and much more. It is very clear that reaching the targets that we have set to ourselves will require action by all sectors of our economy to develop new technologies, to improve private and public transport, to achieve transition in the energy sector, and much more. And working with international partners to improve global environmental standards is also an important part of our approach. I'm very happy in particular that Mrs. Elina Bardram from the European Commission's DG CLIMA is with us today, because she's the real expert, and she'll be able to share with you the details of our policy. The implications of the Green Deal go far beyond just environmental regulation. And for me, this is particularly important, and especially now during these times when the world is dealing with the COVID pandemic. I mentioned before that the Green Deal was adopted in 2019, and one could be tempted to think that it has been overtaken by the COVID crisis on the list of priorities. But in fact, quite the opposite is true. And I think that there's a realization by many that this is the moment for us to collectively rethink how we manage the risks facing the world, both individually and collectively, how to make economies and societies even more resilient, and also to look at some of the links between, for instance, climate, health, and biodiversity. To make sure that post-COVID economic recovery is also sustainable. So to put simply, to build back better. The EU and Iceland are very good partners. We are partners who share the same values across the board. We believe in democracy, we believe in defending human rights, and we also share a very strong commitment to fighting climate change. So this is an area in which I hope we can further work together in the future, including when it comes to technology and energy transition. Iceland is already a world leader in clean electricity and clean heating. with nearly all of the local needs met with renewable energy. Iceland possesses great know-how and has already proven to be quite an inspiration for other countries who want to harness their own resources. We have to be realistic, and we know that today Europe, in fact, only produces a very small part of the world's CO2 emissions. So even with our own best efforts internally, even if we are the best students in the class, we are unlikely to see a real global difference unless we get other big polluters and other big polluting countries on board. And again, this is something where I believe the EU and Iceland can work together as partners on the multilateral stage to convince other countries to be ambitious and also to support them in reaching their own climate targets. So I will stop here. Thank you again for having me with you today, and I look forward to a rich discussion in the 2 hours that we have. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for this nice overview. I would like to continue right away with the second speaker. I would like to introduce the Honorable Acting Director of the Directorate of CLIMA.A, Ms. Elina Bardram from the European Commission.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you also for the co-panelists, and especially Ambassador Samcová for having made the time available for our conversation. And I certainly am very pleased to be exchanging with representatives of the Icelandic academic community, but not only that, also the businesses and other interested stakeholders. So a very pertinent time to have this seminar. And it's also very interesting for us as the EU to see what type of alignment we have with our key partners as we approach the 5-year celebrations of the Paris Agreement. As was pointed out earlier, I am the Acting Director for International Mainstreaming and Policy Coordination. But for the past 7 years, I've been leading on international relations in DG Climate Action, including 5 years as the head of the EU delegation to the UNFCCC climate negotiations. So I was there from Lima to Paris, all the way through to Katowice, when we agreed the so-called rule book for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So Iceland and EU share a lot of the kind of political philosophy and approach in the context of the international climate negotiations. Also, by the virtue of the European Economic Area, there are certain very strong links for us to collaborate in the context of taking climate ambition to the next level. Our DG, Directorate General for Climate Action, is the lead department for the European Commission for formulation of climate policy and politics. We also undertake with the EU member states a lot of the strategy development in view of international engagement and climate diplomacy. We lead on the international negotiations and we implement the EU's emissions trading system. We also monitor the national emissions of EU member states through the so-called governance regulation and the integrated climate and energy plans, which are member state-specific strategies for delivering on the country-specific targets. We also, of course, work together with the other departments of the Commission to promote low-carbon technologies and the uptake of adaptation measures. This Commission, Ursula von der Leyen Commission, has irreversibly pivoted the European climate ambition into the very heart of its work program. The European Green Deal is an unprecedented, comprehensive package of policies and regulations. Next slide, please. Now, globally, we of course know, and this was also said in David's initial opening, we are not ambitious enough. The collective contributions, the aggregate of the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement do not give us enough confidence to reach the 2 degrees target, let alone stay within the 1.5 degrees, which is of course a commitment for all parties to pursue efforts towards. In fact, with the current targets by the international partners, we are heading somewhere between 2.7 and 3.2 degrees. And this is if the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are implemented in full. So there really is no space for complacency. Next slide. Since the Paris Agreement, climate science has gathered even more evidence, including on the impacts of the 1.5 degrees, the tipping point, if you like, of some of the more detrimental, irreversible impacts of climate change. While we can understand that the immediate priority for the global community at the present time is tackling the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, this must go hand in hand with the willingness to use further recovery investment to accelerate the transition into low carbon economies to the net zero emissions. We have to insist that as we recover, we also build back better, as was said by Ambassador Samcová. It is not an option for us to be using money that we are now effectively borrowing from the future generations to invest into redundant or soon to be redundant fossil fuel industries and energy structures, which would result in carbon lock-in and stranded assets for the years to come. Climate science is certain and without any doubt showing us the pertinent case for action. And this action will not be driven by ideology, but the economic logic and the need to provide for a future fit system and society for the next generations. Next slide, please. Now, what we have seen in the past years is really a kind of gathering of a storm. The COVID-19, which is currently really feeling or being felt around the world across all the continents, will result in a recessionary trend. Communities, societies will have to struggle with an economic distress for years to come, but all of that problem gets dwarfed when we look at the greater picture of climate change, biodiversity collapse, and the accentuated situations of conflict which would ultimately drive war. So that's why we have been particularly encouraged on the EU side by this recent announcement by the government of Japan, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, for their commitment to pursue a net zero pathway by 2050. If we get a critical mass of international players pledging and committing to that type of transition, it will provide investors, global investors, economic actors, and citizens the certainty that they need in order to guide behavioral change and investment patterns that are compatible with the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees scenarios. All of the worst climate impacts, including a possible resource generated or resource scarcity generated war, can still be avoided if the international community comes together. The political conditions have, of course, become more favorable also in the aftermath of the US elections, where Biden administration, incumbent administration, has already made very clear commitments to rejoining the Paris Agreement, holding an international climate summit, and really changing the direction of travel insofar as the United States is concerned. Next slide, please. For the EU, Ursula von der Leyen got a very strong mandate through the EU elections. Climate change was clearly in the center of the electoral campaign. And in fact, 93% of the European citizens feel that climate change is a serious concern. 79% rank it as a very serious concern, putting it right up the top of the priorities for political action. We have seen campaigning in the form of Fridays for Future. We have seen quite hardcore campaigning as well in the context of the Extinction Rebellion. But all of this has made the politicians and the regulators painfully aware of the must and the need to act decisively in order to have further support of the people. Now, as I said earlier, we know from the European perspective that this can be done. Next slide, please. Since 1990, the EU greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by 23%, while our economy has grown by 61%. This is a very, very tangible example of what can be done with determined and decisive policy reforms and incentive structures that allow the public and the industry to shape their behavior. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that we feel is a key driver for our leadership and action is, of course, our long-term strategy. All countries of the Paris Agreement, all the parties to the agreement, have an expectation to come forward with a long-term strategy that would be consistent with the goals enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And this means not just the temperature goals, but also the goal of becoming or achieving a balance between sources of greenhouse gas emissions and sinks of greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. arriving at climate neutrality as soon as possible during the second half of the century. For the EU and for all advanced economies, this should be no later than 2050. And it is in light of this and in light of the findings of the IPCC that the EU became the first climate neutral continent, or will become by 2050. Major economy. I think if we speak of continent, that would actually also encompass some parts of Russia. So with this commitment, we have modeled a very extensive impact analysis of what the different sectors should do, what kind of policies we should implement in order to ensure that we reach climate neutrality, net zero emissions by 2050. As you will see at the very end of the, or on the extreme right hand side of the graph, we don't expect the EU to become completely free of emissions. But what we do see is a balance between land use sector, land use change, and different bioenergy solutions that would allow us to suck the remaining emissions out of the atmosphere, so that at net level we would be emitting a clear zero. Next slide. Now, where do we find all these different sector policies? Where do the EU emissions come from? It's quite clear that energy, transport, buildings, industry, and agriculture are areas of immediate action. What we see is that energy supply alone accounts for some 28% of the EU emissions. Similarly, transport sector is one of the key emitters, with a great share of 20% of the total emissions, followed tightly by industry with 19%, and residential and commercial, of course, is also among the top emitters with 13%. There are other sectors such as agriculture, waste, international aviation, and international shipping that require further policy action in order for us to reach the net zero. Next slide, please. So, but as was said earlier by Ambassador Samcová, this is not really a green agenda in a sense of only talking about ecological aspects. the vision of climate neutral continent has to go together with a vision for job creation, just transition, inclusiveness. And it would be a great omission not to reflect this across the Commission. The Green Deal is, on the one hand, as Ursula von der Leyen has put it, a vision, but it is also a very concrete and extensive list of activities. There are some 50 initiatives, policies, legislative proposals that are foreseen in a certain timeline that will be the enablers of the 2050 net zero. If you put the next slide up, we can cover a little bit about how the European Green Deal is composed. Next slide, please. The Green Deal is about transforming the EU's economy for a sustainable future. So we're really talking about an overhaul of the philosophy, an overhaul of the way we've been doing things, because we can no longer risk our future competitiveness by using our investments to do defensive industrial strategies. We need to become much more determined in putting our best foot forward and secure our share of the low carbon marketplace, which we believe is going to be the marketplace of the future. Next slide, please. We have to do this in a way that leaves no one behind. No part of society, no coal miner, no fossil fuel industry worker should feel that they are not part of the change. The executive vice president often puts it like, you know, there has to be just transition, otherwise there will just not be transition. So one of the big parts of our agenda is to look at retraining, reschooling, reskilling labor force and finding real and viable alternatives for the employment that we currently see, for instance, in Poland in the coal sector. This is also a challenge for other countries such as Spain and Greece, and we will be working tightly with the member states to develop transition mechanisms and funds to facilitate the change. Next slide, please. One of the central planks of the EU's vision and strategy is, of course, the increasing of our climate ambition, the NDC of the EU, for 2030 already. So only this week, European leaders will be hopefully reaching their agreement or acceptance of the increase from at least 40%, which is our current target compared to 1990 levels, to at least 55%. So we're really talking about a step change that should align investment and industry strategies in a radical way. Next slide, please. Of course, ambition is not enough. We need to ensure that there is a continued supply of clean, affordable, and secure energy. Next slide. We need to ensure that the industry feels a part of the change, and there's already been a proposal for an industrial strategy, which puts not only the Green Deal, but also the digital transition into the epicenter of the European action. Next slide. We need to ensure that circular economy drives also renovation, building, and the so-called renovation wave within the EU. 40% of the emissions can be attributed to building sector and infrastructure in the EU. So while it's split between the previously presented industry, transport, etc., it is still something that has to be tackled also through including and enhancing the renovation and making buildings better fit with insulation, retrofitting, and also including enhancing their adaptive capacity. Next slide. The zero pollution ambition, which is one of the environmental planks comes with job opportunities as well, because transforming to a toxic-free environment requires localized action and action also at city level. Next slide, please. We also have to work to preserve and restore ecosystems and biodiversity. Nature-based solutions is something that's being widely discussed, not just within the EU, but also as we prepare for the China-hosted Biodiversity COP next year. We feel that the EU leadership has to be exerted in this area. Next slide, please. Also, the farm to fork strategy, which has been put forward, which has at its heart fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly produced food system, goes beyond this. Forest strategy is how we use our land assets to manage greenhouse gas emissions, to make sure that the nature can actually contribute to our efforts to tackle climate change through preservation of biodiversity, is part of our vision. Next slide, please. And then finally, accelerating the shift to sustainable and smart mobility through transport solutions, tightening CO2 standards in cars, but also looking at transport modes such as rail and public transportation as viable alternatives, which they unfortunately too often are not yet to the low-cost airlines, etc. We have, of course, as a result of COVID, seen a major shift in the culture vis-a-vis transport, and we will need to make sure that as we recover, that we learn from the lessons of the past. Next slide, please. And of course, we have no illusions. This transition comes at a cost. Financing is going to be absolutely key. And we have a sustainable investment strategy. We have a sustainable finance strategy, which are also parts of the key enablers of the European vision. Next slide, please. And as I already mentioned, leaving no one behind is going to be key. Next slide. Research and innovation have to be harnessed to serve this transition agenda. In the Horizon EU, which is our research budget managed from the European Commission side, we have seen some 37% spent on climate innovation and research. This comes on top of the so-called Innovation Fund, which is making use of the ETS revenues for specifically fostering innovation and dedicated projects such as CCS, wind and hydrogen. Next slide. And only this week, I already earlier talked about how important it will be for us to keep the citizen on board, to empower and enable them to be part of the policy making and feel like they have viable choices to take forward. We as policymakers do not regulate for ourselves. We regulate for the people and the citizen. And for that reason, we are only next week launching a so-called Climate Pact platform, which is catering for engagement of civil society, of NGOs, of businesses in a conversation and knowledge sharing way that also involves the EU institution. So we have a permanent platform for continued conversations and exchanges in order to make sure that what is being proposed and implemented at the regulatory level is serving the needs and the expectations of the people. Next. And of course, we feel that all of this, all of the policy work and effort, which is admittedly keeping us very busy, gives us good scope to act as a global leader. The Green Deal communication puts different types of green alliances, strategic cooperation, particularly with the G20 countries that collectively account for more than 80% of global emissions, in the very heart of our priorities for external action. We will be using all our external heading instruments and other policy instruments, such as trade policy, strategic partnership agreements, etc., to promote the uptake of robust and ambitious climate action. Next slide, please. So we leave the Green Deal, talk a little bit about the policy context now. We had the Green Deal communication. In March, we put forward a climate law that enshrines the climate neutrality into a legal obligation, and the Circular Economy Action Plan came forward at that point as well. The industrial strategy that I mentioned before was put out just before the COVID lockdown started during the first wave. What is interesting that industrial strategy, together with the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Farm to Fork and the EU Biodiversity Strategy, have indeed now become a part of the core formula that will drive our recovery. Next slide, please. So, as Timmermans, my executive vice president, has put it, we're going to invest billions. In fact, it's going to be more like trillions into the recovery. And we should not sink it into obsolete 20th century fossil fueled economy and soon to be stranded assets, but rather use it responsibly to build a competitive, inclusive and green economy for the 21st century, for our jobs and for our health. We hear a lot being said about intergenerational moral obligation, which of course means that the decisions we make today will determine the future that our children will be living in 20, 30 years' time. Next slide. So in June, the EU recovery plan, or July, the EU recovery plan, the so-called Next Generation EU, was agreed. What it means that in addition to the multi-annual financial framework, which is the EU's core budget of 1 trillion and some, we will be lending or borrowing from the markets some 750 billion to stimulate and recover better in the future. 30% of the overall budget, so of the 1.8 trillion euros that will be unleashed in the next 7 years, will be used to climate action specifically. 30%, which is a significant sign of the way we see our future economy shaping as part of the recovery, but as part of the implementation of the Green Deal itself as well. Of the regional development funds, 37% will be channeled towards climate action, which means that the regional cohesion, the regional aspects and cross-border cooperation will have even a stronger climate accent to it. Next slide, please. Where we will be going next, we have already put forward a proposal for EU strategies for energy system integration and hydrogen, which is intended to pave way to a fully decarbonized, more efficient and interconnected energy sector. On the 16th of September, as Ursula von der Leyen tabled her European Union speech, we indeed proposed the target and put forward the vision of 37% of Next Generation EU to be spent directly on the Green Deal objectives. At the moment, the member states are working on the individual recovery plans, and one of our requirements for funding member states' recovery plans will be that both the Green Deal priorities and the digital transformation priorities are incorporated into those strategies in a way that allows us to ensure climate proofing of action. The renovation wave and the methane strategy have been proposed only recently, and the reception so far has been very welcoming. In addition, on the 19th of November, we put forward an EU strategy for offshore renewable energy, which is of course another area of future potential. Next slide, please. So this week, Friday, we hope that the climate target will be agreed. And in the end of the month, the Climate Pact to engage civil society will be launched with a big public event. 5th of February, we foresee the end of 4 public consultations on the new revised legislation that will then deliver on the 55% target. That includes EU emissions trading scheme, effort sharing regulation, land use change and forestry, as well as the regulations on CO2 standards for cars and vans. During the first quarter, we will also be coming forward with our EU adaptation strategy, because it is not enough for us to mitigate. Some of the adaptation action is already taking place, but as we see extreme weather events and other negative aspects of climate change becoming increasingly omnipresent in our daily lives, we have to make sure that our preparedness as a society to deal with these phenomena is enhanced. And of course, you may have heard of the Corbyn border tax adjustment, or the border measure that we are currently developing in view of coming forward with a measure that's WTO compatible and allows us to avoid carbon leakage beyond EU borders. And in November 2021, we hope to rejoin our international partners at the COP26 in Glasgow to have a serious conversation about global ambition, for which we do believe the conditions have become much better now. Next slide, please. Okay, then a couple of words before we move on Circular Economy Action Plan. Next slide. And I'll be going through quite quickly. The circular economy is about creating a cleaner, more competitive Europe. The action will be driven by legislative and non-legislative measures in areas where action at the EU level brings real added value. So it's about promoting sustainability of products and design. It's about fostering sustainable consumption and aiming to ensure that the resources used are kept in the EU economy for as long as possible. At the moment, it's just some 12% of EU industrial materials is from recycled sources. We have estimated that that could go up to as high as 50%. Next slide. So it is also about changing the way we produce and consume, product placement in the EU market so that the products can be designed to last longer, restriction of single-use plastics, for instance, tackling premature obsolescence. So there's a whole host of different specific activities included in the Circular Economy Action Plan. I will not dwell on all the details at this point, but I would invite you to look at the policymakers' summary, which are readily available on our websites. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of the suggested measures. Picking here maybe the single-use products phased out, where we see that wherever possible, these should be replaced by durable products for multiple use. For acting on microplastics, which is a hugely worrying area, we would want to restrict internationally added microplastics, increasing the capture of microplastics and all relevant stages of the product cycle. So it's about making a more durable, more lasting production, and also decisively reducing the kind of need to dismiss elements or ingredients from a circularity, positive circularity context. Next slide, please. Then a couple of words on the energy systems, and particularly on hydrogen. Our strategies for energy system integration and hydrogen are of course essential for reaching our overall net zero objective. Next slide, please. This proposal came forward on the 8th of July. To us, this means that the system is planned and operated as a whole, linking different energy carriers, infrastructure and consumption sectors. And the strategy builds on 3 main pillars: a more circular energy system with energy efficiency at its core, a greater direct electrification of end-use sectors, and finally, for those sectors where electrification is difficult, introducing and promoting clean fuels, including renewable hydrogen and sustainable biofuels and biogas. Next slide. Overall, the energy strategy includes some 38 actions, and the hydrogen strategy, which can support the decarbonization of industry, transport and power generation and buildings across Europe, as hydrogen can power sectors that are not suitable for electrification, thereby providing storage to balance variable energy flows. And we here see a gradual transition. From 2020 to 24, the installation of at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolysis in the EU would result in production of up to 1 million tons of renewable hydrogen. From 2025 to 2030, we'd enhance this to 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen. And from 2030 to 2050, renewable hydrogen technologies should reach maturity and be deployed at large scale across all hard to decarbonize sectors. Next slide, please. Finally, leading on the green change or green transition agenda globally, what does this mean for the EU? Next slide, please. We are very ready to admit that being responsible for just some 8% of global ambitions, the EU can simply not solve this problem on its own. So our commitment is to lead by example, but to use diplomacy, trade, development, cooperation, and other strategic partnership tools to advance climate action. We also want to set standards for sustainable growth across global value chains. And this can be done with many of the policy instruments that we have proposed at European level can be inspiration or examples for those countries who are to deliver on the Paris commitment and transition to a net zero economy. Next slide, please. On our global action agenda, we will be working with Africa. We will be engaging in particular with the G20 countries. We will be setting up a green agenda for Western Balkans and also enhancing our partnerships with Eastern partners and the Southern neighborhood. Those countries in the immediate geographical proximity of the Union are, of course, also key in combating carbon leakage, because we cannot have persistently different levels of ambition if we want to be trading as equals and avoid the notion of level playing field being compromised. We will ensure that green alliances are part of our international relations, be it Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, Asia, or the Pacific. And this, of course, includes our privileged partners such as Iceland and Norway and of course, hopefully UK, as we come to the next stage in our relationship. Next slide, please. I will finish with a thank you for listening to me. I think I went a couple of minutes over time, but I hope it has been interesting, and I look forward to the conversation to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can give her a virtual applause to this very extensive and nice overview of the European deal. I would like to go right over to the next speaker. We have a slight change in the official program. I would like to introduce the Honorable Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Action of the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Iceland, Mrs. Helga Barðadóttir. Please, if you could share your slides, and then the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, thank you. And do you see the presentation, or I'm not fully aware of what you can see?
Yeah, it's full screen.
Now we see the
Full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I work at the Ministry for the Environment and Natural Resources and was asked to give you a brief overview of our climate action plan, which we issued in June this year. Actually, I stepped in for my colleague Anna, who was in charge of the was in charge of the work on the action plan for the ministry. And so, to be able to introduce our action plan, I think it's important to give you a brief overview of our emission profile, which is maybe a bit different from many other countries we compare ourselves to, as we do not have any emission from electricity or heating. As if I remember correctly, it was 20% in the European Union, but we have huge emission from heavy industry, mostly aluminum and ferrosilicon, and these are also the sector where we have had the main increase since 1990. We also have very high emission from road transportation and fisheries. And the good thing is that we have high potential for uptake of CO2 by afforestation and revegetation and reclaiming of dried wetland. And this is our emission profile. You see, although no emission from electricity production or heating, we have a high emission from energy, which is mainly transportation and fishery, the burning of fossil fuel. And the orange bar is the power intensive industry, and you can clearly see how it increased in 2007 and 2008. And there is agriculture and waste. And agriculture has been very stable for many years, and waste as well. Iceland has its commitments for the Paris Agreement. Iceland and Norway share the target with the EU for 40% reduction target. And the target is divided into effort sharing and ETS. And our climate action plan focuses on the emission that falls under the effort sharing, where individual countries get their individual targets. But under the ETS, there is no individual target for neither Iceland nor other countries within the EU. So just to set the action plan in some perspective. And under the effort sharing, Iceland has the 29% target. The target is set by the same rules or same methodology for each country, and based on the GDP and share of renewables in the countries and share of emission from agriculture. These are the main parameters by setting the target. And as you can see, Iceland has a 29% target, where 40% is the maximum target, where Luxembourg and Sweden has the maximum target. And this is the emission that falls under the effort sharing, divided into sectors. And here we have taken out the emission from the that falls under the effort sharing. So we have the biggest share is from energy, the burning for fossil fuel, road transport, and fishing, and from the fishing fleet, or fishing industry. And then we have agriculture, asset, waste, and the F-gases, which have been increasing for the last few years, but we hope to see that part of our emission goes down by our measures that we set. So then we have set the scene for the action plan, and we had an action plan in 2018, new action plan with new measures. So the action plan that we presented in 2020, in June this year, it was an update, dated actions, new actions, and we focused on the impacts derived from the different measures set forth. It was, although we steered the work from the Ministry for the Environment, it was work initiated by many other ministries, and we had this interministerial committee with representatives from, for example, Minister for the Finance, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries, Industry. So it's very important that we see this as a cooperation, that everyone has their ownership of this work. And we also had the municipalities. They are playing a big part in this work as well. Public consultancy was also important for us, because we think it's important that we have inputs from the general public for work like this, and we took that into our work. And when we finalized this work, it was also put into consultation, and we will use the results of that for our further work. And this is just to show you how we put this forward in our action plan, and different sectors that we took into consideration. And we, as we said, there are different actions within each sector. Sometimes, for example, land transport is as you hopefully remember, that is a big part of our emissions. So therefore, of course, we put lots of effort in the transport sector. And we have, I say, different actions in different sectors. I'm not going into details in these measures, because you can just look them up in our homepage, and if you have questions, we can of course give you further information, but I think this is not the venue for very detailed information on its actions. Although the main focus is on the effort sharing part of our mission, we also have a few actions under the ETS and under the LULUCF sector. And I said the LULUCF sector is of course important, as we need to use the land sector to abate emission. And it is estimated that with these actions set forth in this action plan, we will reach 35% reduction to 2030. And it is also estimated that we will get extra or more additional reduction with measures that are in preparation. That is, measures that we have not finalized or not implemented yet, but are on the table. So we will hopefully have them implemented in very near future. So we are very, very optimistic that our action plan is realistic and that we will meet our targets. And this is just to put it forward on a picture how we foresee that we will reach our target. You see the dotted line, which is the business as usual line, and that would mean with no measures. The black line shows where we will be with our action plan, and how the projected emission by implementing measures in preparation, and that will give us 40 to 46%. That's very optimistic, but that's we think that it shows that it is possible to reach our target. And this shows how we see the different sectors come into this target. And of course, carbon sequestration from the land sector will also play a part in our targets, as I said before. And this is, there you see the LULUCF sector here, how that will add to our targets. So what are our biggest challenges here? I mean, I set a question mark to the tourism industry. That has been our biggest industry for the last few years, but we have in a kind of new world now. And the world was changing while we were issuing and working on our action plan, actually. So we don't know exactly what will happen in the next few years, but for the last few years, the tourism industry has been our biggest challenge, as in Iceland, rental cars are a very big share of all registered cars in Iceland. And that's because all the tourists that comes to Iceland wants to be able to drive around the country. So we see that as a challenge to have the car rentals to change their focus on to zero emission cars. And that is a challenge to change the fleet of the car rentals, for example. Agriculture is like I think in most of the countries we know, at least, is a challenge. There's no obvious way to reduce the emission from agriculture unless you just have fewer livestock. And of course, as Elina talked about so much, is the green recovery after the pandemic. How are we to come back with greener and better solutions than we had before in the new world that we are building after the pandemic? And we have had, and the government has had a few incentives that are to boost, for example, the energy transition in the transport sector, for example. We have been building new infrastructures in the harbor, electrifying the harbors with the new funding that comes from a recovery fund. So we are looking into these sectors as well. And just to make sure that action plan like this is like a work in progress. You can never just issue the final action plan. You have to work on it. You have to estimate what you get. Are this the right actions you put forward in the action plan? What is the projection on how they work? And if you see that they don't work, you have to change or implement new actions. So that's the work ahead of us, and we will yearly issue a progress report on how we get along with our targets, and by that we will take the status of the progress and see if we have to implement more or new actions. To see more information on our action plan, you can just see the co2.is, where you have more information, more detailed information on its actions and how we implement them, who are responsible for them. We put a big effort on that every measure was on someone's responsibility. Might be a different ministry or the municipalities, but it's very important that every measure is someone has responsibility of implementing these actions, and so that's the work ahead of us. Yeah, I think that's the main message I wanted to give you. And of course, there are when we were working on the action plan is now it's legally binding to issue this action plan every 4 years. And the updates of the action plans is to be issued before the Parliament to the Minister every year. So that's the process in this. So yeah, I think I don't have anything else to say at this point, but
thank you very much, Helga Barðadóttir. Yangshu, maybe if you, just for those who just joined the, this Zoom conference, the Zoom conference is being recorded, and of course it will, the full conference will be made available on the website, on the CIF website, and on other organizers' websites. Also, we have, if you have any questions regarding the Green Deal or regarding the Icelandic Climate Action Plan, please feel free to post your questions into the chat so that we can discuss them after the last presentation. We will have one more presentation. Also, we have an interactive Menti webpage. Maybe Yangshu, if you could just share the slide again where people can, or share the screen where people can submit their answers. We see we have already 25 answers to the question, who is responsible to tackle the challenges of climate change? If you would like to participate in this, we will discuss it at the end of the fourth presentation. Please go to www.menti.com and type in the code 4563523, and then we will discuss at the end of the 4 lectures the outcome of this survey. And again, if you have specific questions, type them in the chat of the Zoom meeting so that we can go over all the questions at the end of the meeting. I would like to welcome now our last speaker, but certainly not least, Honorable CEO of Greenfo. Greenfo is an Icelandic company that does carbon accounting, Mr. Stefán Sveinbjörnsson. Mr. Stefán Sveinbjörnsson, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me as well.
Yes, we hear you clear and loud. So please share your slides and the floor is yours.
Definitely will. And thanks, Helga, for giving me more time to give my presentation. It's greatly appreciated, and I'll try to be as precise and quick as possible. So hopefully now you can all see my screen. And perhaps, David, if you wave, if you can see it.
Yeah, looks good. Okay,
great. So my name is Stefán Sveinbjörnsson. I'm the sort of founder CEO of a startup, which we call Greenfo. And we're basically developing a solution that's for climate accounting for companies. It's taking a new approach in how it's being done. It goes into more detail, more automation, because having sort of, developed the climate accounting and work with a firm that's tried to do as much as it could possibly in regards to climate change, I always found that if you don't know how much you're emitting, you can't really take measure how to reduce it. So that's sort of the goal of trying to get all the emissions throughout the value chain for companies. But today I'm going to talk about climate accounting, going to sort of detail what it is, or not so much detail, and do we need it? I would say climate accounting, it's very similar to financial accounting, is that we're just bookkeeping, what is the climate impact of our decisions, of our operations. And to do that, we convert the use of materials and other transactions into climate effect value or warming potential. The most commonly used is CO2 equivalency. And it basically means that all greenhouse gas emissions have been converted in a simple term into the warming potential of CO2. So methane has 25 times the warming potential of CO2. So 1 kilogram of methane would be converted into 25 kilograms of CO2 equivalency. To convert the use of materials in transaction, we use known and established emission factors for sort of exchange rate. So for an example, by burning 1 liter of diesel, we know, the kilograms of CO2 equivalency by burning that per liter of diesel. So that's sort of how we keep the accounting. The problems with climate accounting that today it isn't really used to assess the whole value chain. It only addresses a small portion of, what is the climate impact of a company's portfolio or its, of what it's trying to do. It's done after the fact. And I mean by that, a lot of times we, do life cycle analysis or climate accounting after the end of something. And I'll go into more detail about that later. And unfortunately, we use, climate impact or climate accounting in a very limited manner in our decision making. The good thing is that it's a very widely used standards available. the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an excellent organization, has freely available standards in how you should do climate accounting, and it tries to standardize that throughout, the entirety of the world. And I think today about 90% of the companies that disclose their climate accounting use Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and most of the larger companies do. So it is proven, it's freely available, and it's definitely something that should be used and built upon. But what we do is we have the corporate standard, which is here to the left. And to support that, you have the value chain standard. And I'm going to explain a little bit what the difference is between them now. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol basically categorizes the emissions from where they occur within the value chain from the perspective of the reporting company. So in a simple matter, you have scope 1, which is called direct emissions. And probably the most simple example for that is the burning of fossil fuels within the company vehicles that they operate. I think that's a very they control it, that's where the emissions occur. And so that's what they categorize as scope 1. But what they also do is that categorize the indirect emissions that don't occur within the company's scope or within the company's operational boundaries. And then you have the upstream activities, which are basically the emissions that occur before something gets to the company, whether it's a product or the manufacturing or something. And then you have the downstream activities, basically the emissions or the climate impact that occurs after a product or service has left the company and is being used by somebody else. And scope 2, it's the emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling for own use. That gets its own scope because of course electricity is a huge emission factor and categorizes and takes it outside the other scopes. And then you have scope 3, which is basically the emissions from the value chain of the company. But in relation to the two standards I showed you earlier, only scope 1 and scope 2 are mandatory with the corporate standards. And it basically leaves it up to the companies that are disclosing if they want to do any of scope 3 or just a few categories within it. And very, very few companies use the value chain standard or do their climate accounting in accordance with that and do the mandatory corporate standard. And they do select a few of the scope 3 indirect emissions categories. So the most common they do are leased assets, employee commuting, business travel, waste generated within its operation, and then a few do the transportation and distribution. That might seem like a lot, but depending on what the company is and what they do, there are a few activities that are not disclosed and can have a significant impact, specifically looking at the value chain. These are, the production, of purchased goods and services, capital goods, and fuel and energy related activities. That's only with the upstream, and then with the downstream, they might not have the transportation and distribution of the products and services they sell, the processing of their sold products, the use of sold products, and that can be a significant factor, the end of life treatment, and then a few more which I'm not going to go into more detail. So it is a very well-defined scope. It's corporate standard is widely used, but we're only disclosing quite a small amount of what actually a company does today. And as I said, this is mandatory with a value chain standard. So you have to disclose everything if you use that standard in support with a corporate standard. And scope 3 is a lot of times talked about as the iceberg you cannot see. So what's below the sea? So companies might disclose scope 1 and scope 2, but scope 3 can have a significant effect. And here I have the carbon footprint of a washing machine over the life cycle of that and by stage. And you can see most of that is within scope 3. So if you were an electronics store and you were disclosing your climate accounting, you might be doing some of the transport and some electricity use within the store, but 99.1% of what you're doing is outside the company. So, most of their impact is from what products they choose to sell and, how they are used after they sell them. Another thing is with the climate accounting I talked about is it's done as not as an afterthought, but it's done at the end of the year. So many companies do their climate accounting at the end of the year. So for 2020. They would probably start in January, February. They would calculate their emissions, and if they've set a target, it's more of luck if they meet it, because it can be quite difficult to keep track of it. So it becomes more of sort of a luck or chance if they meet it. And I've seen companies with reduction targets in fuel use, and if they meet it, they say it must be working because it was below the target. But if it goes over the target, it's sort of we'll try to do better next year. But throughout the year, they're not really measuring or trying to look at what the emissions are. And we really need to become proactive with climate accounting. We need real-time and automated climate accounting. So if I take that year of 2019 and sort of show it how it went, we really need to sort of measure it in real time. So in the middle of February, we need to do projections within that year and compare it against target. So if we would have done those projections, sort of middle of February, we were going to meet the target. But once we went into May, we really should have known what was happening. So with the climate accounting, we really need to stop doing it sort of after the fact and become proactive and actively measure and project and see if we are meeting the targets that we want to set. So for me, I think I've always looked at this as sort of the breakthrough for climate change or climate impact is that if we get to know the climate impacts of our decision making. So if we have two products, two different services, that we can actually compare the price and the climate impact. For me, that would be a game changer. And just to sort of show you an example, I have here a round trip from Keflavik to Copenhagen, and we have two airlines. We have WOW Air and MAM Air, two very established airlines, and go to Do Up and you get the price. Okay, I'm going to take the cheaper price. Another problem is that we can calculate the emissions, but it can be very generalized, the emission factors. So this is an emission factor from ECA, which I forget what it stands for, but it's the one that's actually recommended to use in Iceland. But the problem is that it only lets you, estimate the emissions between two locations. It doesn't actually let you compare what the difference is. So if you calculate that, because emission from air travel, it's very dependent on the airplane type. What's the cargo and what's the seating capacity. So for those two flights for two different airline types, I've estimated the impact. Well, I calculated the impact of it. So what we really need to do is we have the price and then we have the emissions. So is that lower emission worth, the 5K that we're going to use? For me, once we get here, that's the game changer. And this is the factor we need to do. And sometimes the issue is sort of with the generalized emission factors. Another thing is, I'm going to show you another example of when you have comparison of diesel and electric vehicle cars. And imagine a company, they're going to buy a new car. And once I'm going to show, these are comparable size cars. I'm going to estimate 15,000 kilometers a year, average in Iceland, and the 7-year period. And I'm going to compare a diesel car, new one, an electric car with a smaller battery and therefore a smaller range, another electric car with a larger battery and a larger range. So how we make this decision today is basically, and this is of course for Iceland, you have the fuel, and this is the estimated emissions over that 7-year period. And then we take scope 2 electricity in Iceland, and it's a very, very simple decision going by that. But if we actually take the production into it, scope 3, it can completely change the scenario. And over that 7-year period, it becomes a much more different decision. And you can actually see the impact of the production of the battery, which can be significant, go into that effect. And we're talking about here in Iceland is electrifying transport. And we're only making that based upon the comparison of fuel electricity, and we are ignoring the production impact in other countries. Of course, there's always a net gain, but we really need to account for this in our decision making. And when we take the cost in as well, this comparison becomes quite a bit different. And you can also see with the battery, it has a significant impact on the decision, on the price as well. And it's in my experience that when companies are trying to make the decision, they don't often have enough information to make it. So specifically, if you're going to purchase an electric car and you don't know how much you have to drive and there's some uncertainty behind it, you might go for a higher range car and you're not actually estimating the impact of that. So we really need to take all this into account. And if a company, has that uncertainty and buys the, electric car too, that has a much higher impact on what we're actually trying to do. So I think this can be quite a big snowball effect, because if you choose electric car one, because it meets the criteria that you need, you can almost think about it, you have that extra 2 million to use for another car. So it is sort of a snowball effect by assessing everything. And, we really need to think about it globally, not just what's happening in our local markets. Another thing that's sort of happening now is carbon neutrality and offsetting. And this is a very big trend in Iceland, that a lot of companies are saying they're carbon neutral. And they offer customers to offset their emissions. I'm just going to take one example, where companies offer to plant trees to sequestrate carbon and offset. And I'm going to say that I actually think, planting trees is very important for climate change and specifically for the environment. So I'm not saying what I need to know because I'm against carbon sequestration by planting trees. I'm just showing we need to assess it in reality in our climate accounting. So I think this is sort of what companies are projecting today. So for a given year, they have emissions of 1 ton of CO2, and then they buy offsetting of planting of trees, of 1 ton, and they claim to be carbon neutral. I think you see this a lot today in Iceland. But the reality is that the trees grow over a 60-year period, and during that time, they're actually sequestrating 0.2 tons of CO2 per year, which of course amounts to over that 60-year period, actually amounts to 1 ton of CO2, but you're accounting for that in the year even before you plant the trees. So in reality, the climate accounting should look like this once you take it into account. And it is a completely different way of looking at it. So I'm always, when companies claim to be carbon neutral or offsetting, it really needs to be looked at another way. I think the way on the right is how you account for these offsets. And if you did this for 100 years, so every year you basically emitted 1 ton and then planted trees to sequestrate another 1 ton. So over 100 years you accumulate emissions of 100 tons, and it's 70 tons with sequestration. It does completely change it. So I actually do think carbon sequestration is important, and specifically planting trees, both for environmental and climate impact. But we really need to account for it correctly if we're going to make a real change. So for me, what do we need to do? For me, we need to start approaching climate accounting in the exact same way as financial accounting. Really need to understand it, use it in real time, budget for it, set targets. And in order to do that, we need to do the real-time monitoring and projections. We really need to account for emissions from the whole value chain, because we really need to know where we can have the most impact. So we need to take the entirety of it in our climate accounting. And for me, the largest point in that is also using decision-making. We need to get climate impact, into the same way we understand price. But in order to be able to do that, we actually need to know the climate impact and the climate accounting. So for me, this is key to get things forward. Hopefully I was able to explain a little bit about what climate accounting was in a good way, and hopefully you also think it's what's needed to make real change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, for this really inspiring talk, and actually it shows how you can create a business opportunity out of this shift in shifting away from fossil-based or carbon-based economies towards something that is carbon neutral. I think we had now 4 very exciting lectures, and I think we have we got a very good overview of what challenges we're facing, but also what opportunities lie in those challenges. And maybe I would like to start the discussion by looking at the menti.com outcome of our survey. Yangshu, if you could share the slide again. So So what we asked all participants, the whole audience, and the audience can still continue by typing in answers to the question, who is responsible to tackle the challenge of climate change? And I think already 34 participants have answered the questions, and one thing that comes out is politician government is something that comes out. And I think that the two presentations from the ambassador and from Elina showed very nicely that the European Union, and also from the Ministry of Environment, that the government of Iceland and the European Union, they did an effort and did a huge effort and in creating incentives for government, for industries, and for citizens to shift towards something that is more climate neutral. So maybe I would like to ask Elina Bardram, how does she perceive this when the public comes always and says the government should do more efforts, and how do we increase the social acceptance that the citizens are at the end, because at the end it's every citizen that has to change somehow their habits. How do we increase the social acceptance that finally the policies created by politicians also become reach the target that they are supposed to reach?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I think climate change and the net zero transition by default require a huge amount of public engagement and public involvement. Now, it's very easy to protest or complain about how everything is, reaching a catastrophic tipping point, etc. But at the end of the day, it is through our choices as consumers and as citizens that we shape the regulators' direction of travel as well. So it's through participation in political debates, through active participation in what we have as public consultations before we propose any new piece of legislation. We have extensive public consultations. We organize stakeholder events to really canvass the opinions. And then we have throughout already the Juncker Commission, but now with the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, stepped up our direct dialogue with the stakeholders. We, as civil servants of the Commission, and all the senior managers have pretty clear marching orders to be available, to listen, to exchange with the public and the stakeholders, and to make sure that what we are doing is not only understood by policymakers, but understood also by the broader general public. Now, something that I said already earlier about the need to not just reach out to the converts. There are people with legitimate and valid concerns about how this transformation is going to impact their daily lives. How, for instance, they're going to be providing for their families if the whole city or even a region has been dependent on coal mining. And as policymakers at national and European level, we cannot simply be calling for action if we don't offer viable alternatives in terms of jobs, skills, and opportunities. So, for instance, with the coal regions in transition, which is a dedicated platform, we have made a very clear commitment to developing alternate engagement models for the economy in different regions. And some of the results have been extremely encouraging. Now, when I talk about consumer choices, of course, equally as for the labor market, there has to be consumer choices that are real. And we are not there yet. I think we have to seriously step up our efforts in terms of rail transport, for instance. As an example, last year, we took our delegation for the UNFCCC from Brussels to Madrid for 2 weeks. And there was a real willingness among my staff to take trains as an alternative with less CO2 emissions. But when we looked at the options available to us, the train travel time required would have been up to 20 hours per person, with 3 changes of trains between stations, and a train ticket that cost 3 times as much as the flight ticket directly that took 2 hours. So when the equation is like this, it is very difficult for us to incentivize the more CO2 compatible lifestyle. So we acknowledge that much work is to be done. We have to look at like mobility sector, not just in terms of CO2 emissions in cars, but also looking at, okay, what are the networks options, etc. But I think it's a two-way street. Regulators and politicians must hear from the public. The public needs to be involved in designing these policies, and there has to be a permanent channel, as we now offer with the Climate Pact, for empowerment and engagement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a short follow-up question to become more concrete. What would you say to Icelandic students, Icelandic scientists, and maybe also to Icelandic CEO like Stefán, what he presented? How can Icelanders become involved in the European Green Deal, and what opportunities are there, or what possibilities are there to actually get some of the funding that you presented to become actively involved by contributing to the efforts of the European Green Deal?
Well, at the moment, the EU Green Deal, it's of course, as I said in my presentation, a set of some 50 initiatives, regulations, legislations and policies that in the first phase will of course cover the 27 EU member states. There are, however, possibilities through the research program, for instance, to become part of a coalition or a consortia that would be eligible to apply for Horizon Europe funding. There are international cooperation envelopes, particularly in that regard. Looking at the different public engagement websites, such as in the context of the border adjustment measure, there was an extensive public consultation process, and there will be further events coming up. These are public events, and they're advertised extensively on the European Commission websites. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe as a follow-up question to this, I would like to ask the Ambassador, Lucie Samcová, as a head of the delegation of the European Union to Iceland, how do you see your role, and what can the European delegation do in order to facilitate the incorporation of Iceland and the citizens of Iceland and the companies of Iceland and the students and researchers from Iceland into the activities of the European Union? And what would the delegation of the European Union expect from the Icelanders to facilitate this incorporation of the efforts from Iceland?
Thank you, David, for the question. I think you, in a way, answered yourself. You said, use the word facilitators, and that's precisely who we are in this process. So the role of the delegation is twofold. We are, on the one hand, obviously, as representatives of the EU here in the country, gather information on policies which Iceland is taking, and we relay them back to headquarters. We also get a feeling for the kind of public views and perceptions and how they feed into what we want to achieve in the EU. But it's a two-way conversation. So we likewise inform the public here in Iceland about our policies and objectives and the steps that the EU is taking. And this event is very much a part of precisely that, joining the interested parties in the two sides, sharing insights, sharing experiences, sharing know-how, and making connections. There's of course also the aspect, one was already mentioned a few minutes ago, the participation of Iceland in EU programs. and Iceland has been exceptionally successful over the past few years. We have a lot of talented researchers, scientists, but also NGOs, small businesses who have been able to access EU funding for projects which were either directly or at least in part linked to the environment and to climate. There's also the legal aspect, because of course the legislation which is adopted by the EU is then transposed into countries that belong to the European Economic Area that Iceland is a part of. So when the relevant legislation comes down here, and I'll give the example of the clean energy package that will be coming up in the next couple of years, it will be also a question of the local political leadership engaging with the EU on the specific legislative aspects and transposing them into the Icelandic legal system. So it really goes from the more structured, legalistic, technical cooperation to the very much everyday making connection, sharing experiences. And the delegation is here for that. And use us, reach out if you have ideas on how we can do this better in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador, for this extensive answer. I would like to also ask one question to Helga Barðadóttir from the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources from Iceland. Having heard the 3 lectures from Icelandic businesses and from the European Union and from the Embassy of the European Union in Iceland, how do you feel that the climate action plan of the Icelandic government is aligned with the Green Deal? And are there any plans to increase the cooperation or direct cooperation between the efforts of Iceland within the climate action plan and the European efforts within the Green Deal?
Thank you. Iceland is in very close cooperation on climate issues with the EU, and I foresee that we will follow the enhanced targets that EU will come up with in a few days. And we are also working on our enhanced target, which we hopefully will be able to introduce in a few days, maybe. So I think we will still and will in the future work very closely with the EU on our climate targets. And I think that they are in a way very aligned with what has been set forth in the Green Deal, although we haven't implemented as such, but I foresee that there will be some related legislations that we will implement in Icelandic law as part of the agreement and part of this cooperation deal with the EU on enhanced climate cooperation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe the same question to you. I know that there are RANIS grants that there's currently a RANIS grant open, but what other possibilities are there for Icelanders and Icelandic companies to contribute to the climate action plan that the ministry has put forward, and how what do you expect from the Icelanders and from Icelandic companies and research institutions, how they would, what is the best way to contributing to your efforts?
I mean, if we can't involve the bigger community, the industry, the general public, we won't get anywhere. So I think that's very important that everyone is aware of the actions they can take. We have to maybe change our way of living. We have heard of how for companies can set their own targets and follow up on their targets. So I think there's very many puzzles that have to be put together so we can reach our targets. So I think I can't point out one specific action that people should do, but I think it's huge cooperation task that we have ahead of us. So I think that's how I would like to put it.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe one question to Stefán, who actually showed the business opportunities that are within this game changer that climate change, the challenge of climate change presents to us. Within Reykjavik University, students are attending courses and learning about life cycle analysis, partially also carbon accounting. What kind of expertise would you expect from students if they were to come to your company and say, look, I attended a course and we looked at the theory of life cycle analysis. What are the expertise that you would expect from students coming out of Reykjavik University and asking you directly to join your team in your company?
That's a good question. I think for one, you really need to be passionate about wanting to do something about climate change. I think that would always be number one. Number two, for me, it's more about practicality, because you know, from what I've seen, what's been sort of going on with climate accounting and, you know, different standards, that so much time goes actually into, you know, doing a, you know, environmental report, environmental accounting, climate accounting, that not a lot of time gets into action. So for me, practicality is a big thing. I think sometimes there's quite a bit of a breach between, you know, the science community regarding climate change and action needs to be taken. And I think sometimes we focus, you know, I tend to think that we can get 90% of the impact in an hour in an estimation, but sometimes we spend 99 hours to get the other 10%, which for me, it's, you should get the 90% within that 1 hour and then spend 99 hours to actually, you know, mitigate or do action to try to reduce that 90%. So for me, it's a lot about practicality. We sometimes go a lot into nuance, you know, to go down rabbit holes that don't really have a significant impact. So for me, it's passion and practicality, because I think that's sort of a key thing that's needed to move forward in regards to climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe on a follow-up question, I just checked the price of carbon credits, and it's now currently almost 30 euros per ton of carbon. Maybe 9 months ago, it was at 15 euros. How do you see the change in the carbon pricing, and what opportunities are presented for your company in this change of the carbon pricing?
I mean, I think it would be huge in relation to this, that it goes into decision making. And another thing I see with the EU taxonomy in regards to climate change, that you really need to know how much you're emitting. So you really need substantial information, and you need to stand by the information regarding the climate change of the company. So if you pair those two things, I think anything in relation to, you know, knowing the climate impact of company, whether it's for investment or for a company, is a huge market going forward. For me, the climate accounting is going to be in the same standard as financial accounting in a few years. It's, you know, it's going to be the same size of market.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to give now the audience an opportunity to get their questions answered. Einar Torfi Einarsson, he has been collecting all the questions and has been making a list of the most important questions. So we will answer now the questions, but I will give the microphone to Einar because he has been monitoring all the questions. I see that there are over 20 questions posted. So Einar, maybe you could start with the most interesting question first, and then we go through the whole list of different questions.
Yeah, hi everyone. If we just start with a question from Martin Regelsberger to Mrs. Bardram. Did the EU not miss a huge opportunity with the recently decided agricultural budget despite of the Green Deal? If yes, then why?
Thanks. I will still take this question, but then I do have to bow out. My executive vice president is preparing for a meeting, so I have been summoned to have a debrief with him. On the cap, I think the glass is always half empty or half full. We do think that there's been a lot of serious efforts to improve climate mainstreaming in this context. But as with any regulatory ships or vessels that have been going one way for a long time, it will take us time to climate-proof entirely the cap, as it were. This being said, and this goes back to some of the earlier interventions, including by the Greenfo, accounting and using forests and other natural assets and having a sense of climate farming or carbon farming somehow in our future policies is something that we hope will incentivize sustainable land use management and climate compatible practices through agriculture sector reform, land use sector reform, as we move along with the European Green Deal. So no, I don't think we missed an opportunity, but I do also accept that there could have been much more comprehensive improvements in the capacity where. But as I said, sometimes as regulators, we do deal with realpolitiks that impact our pace of change. And we will continue to work towards providing the incentive structures that help us modernize our agriculture sector. My colleague Frank Gehry will stay on the call, and he can take further questions that are addressed to the European Commission, together with the ambassador, of course. Thank you so much, and thank you for the initiative again to the organizers. Bye.
Thank you, Elina Bardram. Maybe we can give Elina Bardram a big virtual applause. And thank you again for joining us. And we will continue with questions from the audience. Maybe Elina, I give you the microphone back.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see. Let's say a question from Steffi. Is the European Green Deal facing public and political pushback like in the US, where conservatives are still denying the existence of anthropologic climate change? Are there interest groups that are actively fighting against the deal? For example, the Heartland Institute in the US. This question is open for discussion and answer. So, yeah. Perhaps Lucie, would you like to take this question? Or
I think it is really rather a question for the colleague who replaced Mrs. Bardram now that she's departed. I would imagine that obviously there are views that differ on climate change. And we do hear from various parts of the spectrum, but whether we can talk about a consolidated pushback, I wouldn't be able to say. But with this, over to DG CLIMA.
Yes, hello, Frank Gehry here. Thank you very much for this question. I think as Elina Bardram presented in a PowerPoint earlier today, there is a big support in the European society for those actions. And it's interesting to note also that even before the State of the Union address taken by our President Ursula von der Leyen back in September, where she presented the new 2030 target, there was an op-ed published and supported by big industries in Europe, where they were supporting an ambitious target because they provide them with a clear direction of travel and a visibility that business interests also need. So obviously there are some interest that might push back like in other countries, but I would say that the society looks at the climate action differently in the European Union compared to the United States of America, and it's clearly it's clear when we look at the opinion polls. So I would be saying that it's quite different. There are some interest, but there are also some interest that would welcome and that are welcoming such action as they see some opportunities in terms of growth, in terms of business. So that would be the element I would put forward to reply to Steffi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. We have one question here directed to Helga from Runarthor. You mentioned that some of Iceland's action plans are not ready. How significant are their impacts in the future plans? And B, you said that the CO2 emissions reductions in agriculture are impossible without simply reducing the number of farms. Is this the official stance?
Thank you. If I may come first to the second question, it's no, but of course that would help. But we have actions that we are looking into, actions within the agricultural sector, and I have to say that the farmers are very positive and interested in making their agriculture more climate friendly, climate neutral actually. So and we part of the actions that have not yet been implemented or were not implemented when we published the action plan are actually in the agricultural sector, but also in other sectors, for example, in the transport sector, where we have to look into the heavy transport and the fishing industry. These are the main actions that were not accounted for in the action plan, and we are working on now, and they will have hopefully have a significant impact on our reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. We have one question to Stefán about car batteries. Do you take into account recycling of batteries in their lifetime? And data about Tesla's CO reclamation during recycling is at 70%, for example, and only set to improve. There's no comparable reclamation of CO2 emissions. So if I repeat about the car batteries, do you take into account recycling of batteries in their lifetime?
That's a very good question. For this, I only took the production of the LCA, and the numbers I showed you will decrease because a lot of the emissions for the production come from the use of fossil fuel cars. So the more batteries you get into more products, the overall, emissions from electric cars will decrease. So that will continue to decrease. So the question is no, but I think the recycling thing is sort of still ongoing. So the impact of that very differs between the cars. And I didn't have a Tesla car there, so I didn't take the recycling into account.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question to Ms. Bardram. If Frank, would you like to answer one question? Could you say more about the legal status of the European Green Deal? Is it applicable to the EEA member states?
Well, in that regard, we have to distinguish what the EEA is about and the Green Deal, because the Green Deal, as Elina explained, is also a large set of action also internationally. So about the international actions, obviously it's about the European Union action. Whereas in terms of the access to the internal market, yes, indeed, there will be some legal implication and exchange and collaboration with the members of the EEA under the IFTA agreements. So this is something that would be discussed in the following months, obviously, to make sure that the access to the market is consistent with the IFTA agreements.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I see Lucie would like to.
Yes, no, I was just going to complement, if I may. I think we have to distinguish between two things. We have to distinguish between the political ambition and setting of our own targets, and that, of course, it's very much up to Iceland to do that individually. We hope that the ambition of Iceland will tie in with ours and match ours. But that's one aspect, and then there is the legislative aspect, and obviously Iceland, as a part of the EEA, has an obligation to transpose those legal acts which are relevant to Iceland into their own legislation. every EEA state can request exemptions for such transposition to take into account the local constraints and the local context. So it's not as simple as taking a piece of legislation and transposing it completely. We have to respect the two-pillar system of the EEA agreement, but I wanted to make a clear distinction between the political and the legal aspects when we discuss this.
Thank you very much. Maybe one quick question to Stefán. Who and how sets the target per company? Does the climate accounting fall under the corporate social responsibility? Yeah, Stefán, if you're available.
Sorry, very common mistake. I would say yes, it falls under social responsibility. And if you're going to set targets and if you want to meet them, you need to get the highest approval possible for them. So it really needs to come from the top down in approving the targets, but actually estimating the targets can, come from anywhere within the company. But in order to want to meet it and take meaningful action, it needs to be approved by the highest level within the company. That's very much my experience with this.
Thank you. Now we have a fairly large question from Gert Finger in the chat section. I can open up the floor for this question, but since it's a fairly large question, we could maybe start with David's questions, but you can take a look at this question and see if who wants to take on the discussion.
Yeah, I just this was a question from Asbjörnsson. He posted this question and I think we overlooked it. It's about the recycling. So that's why I sent it to you one more time.
Yeah, how does the recycled components come into the life cycle analysis? As in the washing machine, if all the iron is recycled, where is the end of the life of these components? Yeah, this is open for discussion.
In relation to the life cycle analysis of the washing machine?
Yeah, well, how does the recycled components come into the life? Yeah, how does the recycled components come into the life cycle analysis? And
if it can be reused, it's deducted from the emissions over the lifetime. So if it's used in another product, it's actually used as a negative from the total emissions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, that brings us to the last question. I'll just read it out, but I open up the floor for this discussion. If primary energy production by burning fossil fuels is replaced by carbon-free technologies such as wind energy, photovoltaic panels, and hydroelectric power plants, by what percentage have the number of wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, and hydroelectric power plants with artificial lakes have to be increased to meet the climate change? Are these changes technologically feasible? Is nuclear fusion as developed at ITER in consideration? What other clean energy production methods are in development? Will the public accept changes involved with these clean energy production technologies? As I said before, this is open for discussion.
Maybe Frank, maybe you could answer this question first, and then we can have other people answer it as well.
Yes, it's a very good question. What will be the energy production scheme in the future? I think we have to accept that there is a certain number of elements that we don't know about the future. For instance, the solar production of energy decreased quite significantly in the last 10 years, and we don't really know what will be the innovation. So we should, as a EU, we try to stay energy neutral. We try to favor innovation to try to see which energy can provide a renewable scheme. So we are supporting wind energy, solar energy, green hydrogen also, to see if it can help us to deal with a climate challenge. And then obviously we have an impact assessment that might interest Gert Finger to look at about the 2030 target, the 55% that we propose and that we hope our head of states and government would approve later this week. So it's hard to we think, based on the impact assessment, that we can achieve the change that we proposed. But of course, we acknowledge also that we don't know everything. Regarding nuclear fusion, we are not there yet. We have the ITER program, as you mentioned, and we can hope that it will help us to find a solution. But also, I would say that innovation in terms of transport, for instance, sharing, car sharing, that energy efficiency can help us also to achieve energy, to tackle the energy challenge. So these are some elements to share with you, but it's still a debate, and I think we have to acknowledge that we will advance our thinking while innovation will help us to see how we can tackle the challenges. But based on the impact assessments, it is possible to achieve what we propose, but then it's not completely clear which technologies will be the ones to deliver such change in the future. I hope it helps.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this subject?
Maybe I can add some comments to the answer of Frank. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Frank.
So at Reykjavik University, we are investigating renewable energy sources. Of course, Iceland is in the favorable position to have enough renewable resources available to already cover the entire electricity consumption with renewable energy production from geothermal energy and from hydropower energy. But we are collaborating, for example, with countries like Austria, which just is discussing or just put forward a legislation to become 100% renewable electricity production by 2030. So this is in 10 years. And these are, of course, huge changes where also scientists are put forward, and where we try to look into what specific technologies can be used to replace fossil-based electricity production. It is challenging, it is possible, as the Austrian example shows, to shift away from fossil-based energy production towards something that is more sustainable. And it's of course country specific, and of course it's also specific for the location where you are. Different technologies are more efficient in different locations. So we need to work on a local level as well in order to achieve entire carbon neutrality for the European Union. So I think this is something which is ongoing research, and where we need to work together with policymakers. It's just my input to this question. Anyone else would like to? Yeah, Lucie would like to, our ambassador would like to also add a comment to this.
I'll come in briefly just to say, I think you really hit the nail on the head there as well by saying that it's very much dependent on the local context. And we always speak about the EU, but of course the EU is not a homogeneous area of 27 member states. And when we speak about the conditions in Spain and the conditions in Sweden, we're talking obviously about very different potential for harnessing renewable energies. So it is not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution or requirements on individual member states, but working with them very much to make sure that that each set their own strategies depending on their own resources, and taking it even lower to the local level, which also ties in with the question of, will the public accept changes, the changes that are required yes, but we need to work very closely with citizens at the local level, because if the drive is only seen as something that comes from Brussels, it will inevitably not have the same effect as if it's taken up proactively from the grassroots.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think it's now 12 o'clock. Maybe everybody is hungry, and at least some of the speakers have already left because they have other commitments. I would like to thank again everyone for coming and for participating. We were almost 90 participants, which is quite a successful seminar. And I would like to thank especially our invited speakers, Lucie Samcová Hall-Allen, Ambassador of the European Union to Iceland. Thank you very much. The Acting Director of the Directorate of CLIMA.A from the European Commission, Ms. Elina Bardram, the Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Action of the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, Ms. Helga Barðadóttir, and the Honorable CEO of Greenfo, Mr. Stefán Sveinbjörnsson. Thank you very much for joining us for this seminar. I would like to close the seminar now. We will make the full video of this seminar available on the Sustainability Institute and Forum website. And of course, we would also like to thank our funding agencies, Landsvirkjun and Landsnet, that are providing funding to make our institute possible and to provide funds so that we can run our institute. Thank you very much. We would like to close it, but we of course remain open for any questions. If you have questions, please contact us by email or any other means. We are of course happy to continue the dialogue on working towards a more sustainable European Union and world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.